Get out of my office. I don't shake hands with staff. Richard Sloane didn't just say it. He laughed it, leaning back in his chair, tie loosened just enough to look casual in his cruelty. His voice rang like a gavel no one had asked for. To him, it wasn't a statement. It was a verdict. Across from him, Naomi Brooks held her ground. A navy dress, tailored but modest, a black leather briefcase resting against her leg. Her hand had been extended, polite, steady, professional. Now it hung in the air for a moment before she drew it back, slow, unbothered, as though she had offered not a handshake but a test. Richard's smirk widened, feeding off the discomfort around the table. Two executives exchanged looks, one chuckling under his breath, the other forcing a cough to cover it. To them, this wasn't just a handshake refused. It was a hierarchy reaffirmed. Naomi blinked once. No frown, no retort, just silence. And silence can be heavier than anger. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we're glad you're here. Now, back to Naomi. The power play wasn't new to her. At 29, a banker in Chicago had told her, "Deals this size aren't for people like you." At 34, she walked into a hotel she owned and was mistaken for housekeeping. And now, mid-40s, billions later, she stood in this glass cage of a boardroom hearing the same tune again. Different lyrics, same music. Richard leaned forward, his laugh fading into a sneer. "We'll wait for your employer to arrive. These negotiations are above your pay grade." He tapped the table twice, dismissive, as though brushing dust from polished wood. The words landed not as insult but as prophecy, because in less than 5 minutes, the man who refused her hand would be stripped of his place at the table, while Naomi sealed a $2 billion deal under her own name. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to fight for acknowledgement. The storm was already shifting toward her, invisible but inevitable. And Richard, still laughing, didn't know he had just dismissed the very woman who owned the room. The meeting had been scheduled for weeks. The city skyline outside promised prestige floor-to-ceiling windows framing the glow of a world obsessed with power. Inside, however, the boardroom was smaller than it looked. Power here wasn't measured in square footage, but in glances, smirks, and the weight of names whispered around the table. Naomi Brooks had entered without an entourage. No assistants juggling binders. No photographer capturing her arrival. Just her, a black leather briefcase, and the steady rhythm of her heels against the tile. It wasn't the entrance they expected. In this building, power usually announced itself with noise chauffeurs, designer labels, an air of visible wealth. Naomi gave them none of that. She wore quiet, and quiet unsettled them. Richard Sloane, the man at the head of the table, had noticed instantly. The moment Naomi extended her hand, his mind had already placed her somewhere beneath him. Staff, junior, disposable. His laugh was less about her gesture than about confirming the pecking order. Around the table, faces played their roles. A woman in a gray blazer glanced at Naomi's simple watch and dismissed it as cheap. A young analyst scribbled notes without once meeting her eyes. Another man leaned back in his chair, scrolling his phone, convinced her presence required no attention. What none of them knew was that Naomi had designed this moment. She could have walked in with diamonds at her wrist, an army of advisors at her back, and a press release ready to trumpet her name. But she chose not to. She chose simplicity because simplicity reveals truth. It forces others to show who they really are. And here, in this room, truth was already spilling across the table. They thought she was invisible. They thought she was powerless. Naomi's calm had been sharpened over decades. At 32, she remembered standing in a conference room much like this one, presenting numbers that outperformed every competitor. A senior partner had glanced at her dress navy then too, though a cheaper cut, and asked if she was the assistant meant to fetch coffee. She delivered the pitch anyway. And when that same partner lost the contract months later, Naomi had been the one the client called back. Now, years later, the echoes of those dismissals lived inside her, not as scars but as steel. Across from her, Richard was still smirking, still basking in the false security of his own arrogance. "We'll let the real decision-makers take it from here," he said, looking past her toward the door, as if someone more deserving might arrive any moment. Naomi didn't move. She placed her briefcase gently on the table. The sound was soft, but in the tense quiet of the room, it landed like a bell. She knew something they didn't. This was her room. This was her deal. And in 5 minutes, every dismissive glance would turn into regret. The stage was set. The audience just didn't know who the protagonist was yet. The tap of Richard's fingers against the table echoed like a drumbeat of dismissal. He leaned back in his chair, arms folded, and the signal was clear. Others were free to join in. Arrogance is contagious. The first to catch it was Clara Hensley, senior partner, pearl earrings gleaming under the flat office lights. She tilted her head at Naomi, lips curled in a smile that wasn't a smile at all. "Do you mind waiting outside? We'll let you know when your boss arrives. This conversation might get technical." The word technical carried weight. It wasn't about numbers. It was about exclusion, about saying, "You don't belong at this table." Before Naomi could reply, another voice cut in. Mark Jennings, 35, a rising analyst too eager to impress. He chuckled under his breath, loud enough for the whole table to hear. "Honestly, Richard, it's not her fault. HR keeps sending temps without context. Next time, they should at least brief them before dropping them in here." The room answered with low laughter, the kind that fills gaps when dignity has been traded for conformity. A few others smirked without looking directly at Naomi, complicit through silence. Naomi's expression didn't change. She slid a pen from her briefcase and placed it neatly beside her notebook. The gesture was small, controlled, yet it unsettled them more than shouting would have. Richard pressed harder. "Look, miss, what was it again? Brooks? Yes, why don't you take notes for us? It's clear you're in over your head with the numbers." He glanced at the papers in front of him, deliberately leaving hers untouched. The insult landed like a spark in dry wood. It wasn't just disrespect, it was erasure, rewriting her role in the room as though her nameplate could be swapped at will. From the corner, a junior associate named Ethan shifted in his chair. Younger than most, barely 30, he bit his lip. His eyes darted between Naomi and Richard. He didn't laugh. He didn't join in. Instead, he opened his tablet and began typing quietly, logging every word. No one noticed, not yet. Clara crossed her arms, leaning forward. "We should be focusing on the acquisition details, Richard. Wasting time with staff who don't even have clearance feels inefficient." Naomi finally looked up. Just one glance, steady, unflinching. She didn't argue. She didn't defend. She let their words pile like stones, knowing that soon those same stones would collapse under their own weight. The tension grew thicker, the insults bolder. What began as a refused handshake had evolved into a chorus of dismissal. A performance of superiority, acted out in polished suits and practiced sneers. But performances end, and this one was already running out of script. Naomi closed her notebook with a soft snap. Her voice hadn't entered the room yet, but when it did, the silence that followed would change everything. The storm was gathering, and they had no idea it was aimed at them. The laughter around the table carried on longer than it should have, bouncing off glass walls and polished wood, feeding itself like wildfire in dry grass. But Naomi Brooks did not laugh. She didn't frown either. She sat still, a quiet presence that made the noise sound even cheaper. Her hand moved, once closing her notebook with a gentle snap. That was all, and yet the sound cut sharper than any reply could. The executives glanced at her, expecting defensiveness, anger, an outburst they could dismiss. They found none of it. Naomi leaned back slightly in her chair, posture unbroken, eyes steady. Silence became her weapon, and silence, when wielded by someone who knows its value, is unbearable to those who live on noise. Richard shifted first. He had expected her to flinch, maybe even storm out. Instead, her stillness unsettled him, though he masked it behind another smirk. "Well," he said, "at least she knows when she's out of her depth." He tapped his pen against the table, a nervous rhythm disguised as arrogance. Clara filled the gap. "You're awfully composed for someone being escorted out." Her tone was cutting, daring Naomi to rise, to snap back, to prove their caricature of her as unprofessional. But Naomi refused the bait. She placed her pen carefully atop the closed notebook and folded her hands. Her eyes moved slowly across the table, not darting nervously but landing deliberately on Richard, on Clara, on each smirking face. She saw them, and she let them feel seen. The silence grew heavier. Chairs creaked. Someone cleared their throat. What had been amusement a moment ago now carried an edge of unease. Naomi's thoughts moved inward, steadying her like anchors. She remembered being 24, sitting across from a loan officer who spoke to her as though she were a child, dismissing her plan before even reading the first page. She had swallowed that moment, turned it into fuel, and built an empire brick by brick. Today felt no different. Her gaze lingered on Richard last. Calm, unreadable. He mistook it for surrender. But others in the room, especially the young associate Ethan, recognized something else. It wasn't compliance. It was calculation. Richard chuckled again, louder this time, trying to fill the space her silence created. Security should be here any minute. Best not to make a scene. But the irony was already forming. The only scene was his, the loud, desperate attempt to assert control in a room he no longer fully owned. Naomi didn't need to speak yet. The restraint was deliberate. She knew timing mattered more than volume. And when she finally broke the silence, it wouldn't be with defense. It would be with revelation. For now, her stillness was enough. A storm doesn't announce itself by screaming. It waits, it gathers, and then it strikes. And Naomi, patient as stone, let the room learn what silence really sounded like. The silence that Naomi had carved into the room didn't just unsettle Richard. It cracked open space for others to feel. And once silence spreads, it invites witnesses. At the far end of the table, Ethan Cole shifted again. 29, junior associate, first year in the firm. His tablet screen glowed faintly in his lap. At first, he had typed notes out of habit. Now, each keystroke felt deliberate, time-stamped, recorded. Insurance against the ugliness he was watching unfold. He glanced up briefly. Naomi's posture, calm, composed, untouchable, caught him. She wasn't folding. She was waiting. That realization tightened his chest. He lowered his eyes quickly before anyone else could notice, but the seed of conscience had already taken root. 2 chairs down, a guest consultant named Dana adjusted her glasses. She wasn't part of the firm. She'd been invited to advise on regulatory frameworks. And unlike the executives, she wasn't laughing. Her brow furrowed as Richard's dismissive tone carried across the table. Dana reached for her phone, pretending to check emails, but her thumb hovered over the record button. She didn't press it yet, but the option was alive in her mind. In the corner of the room, near the catering station, a catering staffer lingered longer than necessary. He'd come to replace the coffee urn, but paused when the laughter turned sharp. He saw Naomi sitting tall, unshaken, and saw the way the others circled like wolves. He didn't say a word, but his eyes didn't leave her. Even the glass walls betrayed them. Outside in the corridor, a receptionist slowed her pace, catching fragments of raised voices through the seam of the door. She paused, frowned, and whispered to a colleague. The ripple was subtle but real. Inside, Richard noticed the shift. He mistook it for discomfort at Naomi's presence, not at his own arrogance. That was his blind spot. Power had convinced him that silence was consent, when in truth, silence was witness. Clara tried again to pierce Naomi's composure. "I hope you realize this little stunt is wasting everyone's time," she said, her voice pitched for the room, for the audience. But her words didn't land the way she wanted. They fell flat, bouncing off Naomi's stillness, absorbed into the thickening quiet. Ethan typed faster. Dana's thumb brushed the record icon. The catering staffer quietly swapped the urn, eyes flicking once more toward Naomi before slipping out the door. Witnesses had begun forming around her, invisible but undeniable. Naomi's face revealed nothing. Yet somewhere behind her calm eyes, she knew. She knew someone was watching, logging, holding the truth in reserve. And that was enough. Because injustice is loud, but justice often begins in whispers. The boardroom didn't know it yet, but history was already archiving itself line by line, glance by glance, silence by silence. And when the storm broke, those witnesses would matter more than the men who thought they ruled the room. The room had shifted, but Richard didn't feel it. He mistook the unease for control, blind to the weight of eyes gathering against him. To him, Naomi's silence was weakness, and weakness was his favorite sport. He leaned forward, elbows on the polished oak, voice raised so that even the hallway outside could catch it. "Let me make this clear. You are not authorized to be in this meeting. You are not a decision maker. You are wasting our time." The words fell heavy, rehearsed like he'd delivered them 100 times before. But this time, they hit the wrong target. Clara added fuel, her pearl earrings swinging as she shook her head. "Richard's right. We don't hand billion-dollar contracts to outsiders, especially not ones who can't even prove why they're here." She said it sharp, like Naomi was a trespasser in her own house. A few executives chuckled nervously, unsure whether to laugh or to hide. Mark Jennings grinned, flipping his pen between his fingers. Honestly, Richard, she's lucky we haven't called security already. In any other building, she'd be escorted out by now. The laughter that followed was louder this time, bolder, the kind that feeds on cruelty. They weren't just dismissing her. They were building a wall, brick by brick, to shut her out completely. But Naomi didn't flinch. She kept her hands folded on the table, gaze steady, composure unshaken. Her silence was no longer passive. It was deliberate. And that terrified some more than they'd admit. From the far end, Dana the consultant shifted in her seat. She caught Clara's phrasing outsiders and felt her stomach twist. She pressed her phone face down against the table, but her screen was already recording. Ethan typed furiously, capturing every word. Each insult stacked like evidence in a courtroom that hadn't convened yet. Richard smirked, mistaking Naomi's stillness for surrender. "Look," he said, tone dripping with condescension. "We all know deals at this level require credibility. And frankly, I don't see it. Not in your resume. Not in your presentation." His eyes scanned her outfit, deliberately pausing on the absence of designer logos. Not in anything. The insult wasn't subtle. It was scalpel sharp, meant to cut, meant to erase. Naomi inhaled once, slow and measured. No words, no defense. Her silence pressed back harder than any argument could. The room felt it. For the first time, some began to wonder what kind of person doesn't react to humiliation. What kind of person can sit, still as stone, while being dragged through fire? Richard leaned back, convinced he'd won. "Security," he called toward the door. "When they arrive, escort Miss Brooks out." The command was final, the gavel strike of a man who thought he owned the room. But ownership was about to change hands, and the cracks in his authority had already begun to show. The storm was closer now, so close the air itself seemed to hum with it. And Naomi, still silent, was letting it build. The door swung open with a metallic click, and the hum of the hallway spilled into the boardroom. 2 security guards stepped inside, their black uniforms sharp against the sterile glass walls. The taller one, badge-reading Mason, scanned the table, then landed on Naomi. Richard didn't waste a second. He pointed like a judge, delivering sentence. Escort her out. She doesn't belong here." The words were final, sharp, and public. Executives leaned back in their chairs, eager to watch the spectacle play out. Clara smirked. Mark chuckled under his breath. For them, this was entertainment proof that hierarchy still worked. Mason walked toward Naomi, each step heavy, echoing off the floor. He stopped beside her chair and extended his hand, not to shake, but to seize. "Ma'am, you'll need to come with us." The air in the room snapped taut. Ethan froze, fingers hovering above his tablet. Dana pressed her lips together, her phone recording from beneath her palm. Even the catering staffer lingering in the hall leaned against the doorframe, sensing something wrong. Naomi didn't move. Her hands stayed folded neatly on the table, her posture a sculpture of calm. She lifted her gaze slowly, meeting Mason's eyes. Her voice, when it finally broke the silence, was low but sharp enough to slice the air. "Touch me," she said evenly, "and you'll regret it." The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They carried weight, the kind of weight that makes people hesitate. Mason's hand hovered inches from her arm, but something in her tone made him pause. Richard scoffed, misreading the moment. "You hear that? Empty threats. Get her out." His laugh was hollow now, more desperate than confident. Clara piled on. "This is a private board meeting, not a charity event. She has no clearance. Remove her before she embarrasses herself further." Naomi stayed perfectly still. The contrast between her calm and their frenzy widened with every second. She didn't fight. She didn't argue. She let their words pile into a mountain of arrogance, because she knew what was coming next would bury them. Mason shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward his partner, then back at Richard. "Sir, she's not resisting. Maybe, do it." Richard barked, his face reddening. "Now, The room wasn't quiet anymore. It buzzed with tension, unease, anticipation. Phones buzzed silently in laps. Eyes darted, breaths shortened. Something about Naomi's silence had begun to invert the balance. She wasn't the intruder, she was the eye of the storm, and everyone else was about to be swept away. Naomi finally moved. Not a step, not a flinch, just a slow reach into her briefcase. The room stiffened, every head turning as the leather flap lifted. What she drew out wasn't frantic or defensive. It was deliberate. A sleek black phone, screen glowing, a single name already displayed. Her thumb hovered over the call button. Then she said 5 quiet words that shifted the ground beneath the table. "Carla, initiate the protocol. Now." The phone on the table lit the room in a cold glow. Naomi pressed the call button with a calm precision, as if she'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. The boardroom fell into a hush, not respectful, but fearful, the silence of people sensing a power they hadn't accounted for. On speaker, a crisp voice answered almost instantly. "Protocol confirmed, Miss Brooks. Phase 1 initiated." The room shifted. Ethan froze mid-keystroke. Dana's brows shot up, her recording now vibrating with new urgency. Even Mason, the guard with his hand half extended toward Naomi, hesitated. Richard laughed, but it was brittle now, the edge of a man clinging to control. "Protocol? What protocol? This is nonsense. She's bluffing. Take her out." But Naomi's voice rolled over his like thunder over a dying flame. "Carla, log the following. Richard Sloan, Clara Hensley, Mark Jennings. All present, all complicit. Record their words, their actions, their treatment of me in this room." "Logged," Carla replied. "Time, stamped, and archived." The executives shifted in their seats. Clara stiffened, her smirk faltering. Mark set his pen down, suddenly unsure of the game he thought he was playing. Naomi continued, her tone never rising, never breaking. "Proceed to Phase 2. Notify compliance. Cross-check against acquisition documents." "Phase 2 underway," Carla confirmed. "Audit team has been looped in. Corporate counsel alerted." The air grew heavy. This wasn't a bluff. This was infrastructure. A machine bigger than the arrogance sitting at this table. Richard's laugh cracked into anger. "Do you think a phone call scares me? You don't belong here. You don't even—" Naomi turned her eyes on him, unflinching. "You've made that point clear, Richard, repeatedly. And every word has been captured. Every insult, every dismissal. By the time this call ends, the only thing on trial will be your career." Mason, the guard, lowered his hand. He stepped back half a pace, realizing too late he might have been seconds from putting his livelihood in jeopardy. His partner mirrored the move, both of them now watching rather than acting. Around the table, unease rippled. The witnesses who had smirked minutes ago now stared at their notes, wishing they could disappear. Dana adjusted her glasses and dared to glance at Naomi not with pity, but with recognition. Something irreversible was unfolding. Carla's voice returned, steady, unrelenting. "Miss Brooks, confirmation from compliance. Ownership files pulled. Audit logs confirm you are lead signatory on the $2 billion agreement. Documentation secured." The boardroom froze. Naomi's calm sharpened into something steel hard. She leaned forward, folding her hands atop the phone. Her words were quiet, but they carried the gravity of a verdict. "Richard, you wanted me removed, but the only thing leaving this room today is you." The storm had turned, and for the first time, Richard looked unsure of his own ground. The room seemed to contract, walls pressing closer, the glossy table no longer a stage for arrogance but a witness stand. All eyes shifted to Naomi, yet she looked unshaken, as if she had been waiting for this precise moment. Richard cleared his throat, searching for bravado. "This is ridiculous. Compliance doesn't authorize—" Naomi raised a hand, palm calm, cutting him off without needing volume. Her voice was measured, deliberate. "You've called me staff. You've laughed at my presence. You've ordered security to remove me. But what you never asked was the simplest question, who am I?" She paused, letting the words hang. No one dared answer. Naomi continued, her gaze sweeping the table. "My name is Naomi Brooks, CEO of Brooks Global Capital, principal investor in this merger, and the majority shareholder of the very company you thought you ran." Silence detonated across the room. It wasn't empty silence now, it was weighted, crushing, undeniable. Clara blinked, her mouth opening, then shutting again. Mark leaned forward, eyes wide, pen slipping from his hand and clattering against the table. Ethan stopped typing, his breath caught between shock and vindication. Dana's phone recorded it all, her hand trembling only slightly. Richard's smirk disintegrated. The red flush of anger drained into pale confusion. "That's impossible. If you truly—" Naomi leaned closer, her eyes locking onto his. If I truly what? Belonged? Carried the title you tried to deny me? Controlled the $2 billion you've been chasing? Her words landed like hammer strikes, deliberate, unrelenting. Richard stammered, "No one told me." Naomi's voice sharpened, slicing through his excuse. "No one needed to. Respect isn't granted because of introductions. Respect is the price of admission in every room you walk into. And today, Richard, you couldn't afford it." A ripple coursed through the witnesses. Ethan finally exhaled, typing one last line. Revealed, Naomi Brooks, CEO. Dana whispered to herself, "Oh my God," though her phone's microphone caught it clearly. Even the security guards straightened, realizing the imbalance of authority had just inverted completely. Naomi tapped the phone once, Carla's voice still alive on the line. "Carla, confirm the share registry." Carla replied without hesitation. "Confirmed. Brooks Global Capital owns 1% of Sloan Holdings. Effective control is yours, Miss Brooks." The boardroom cracked, the hierarchy shattered. Richard slumped into his chair, suddenly small against the vast table he once commanded. Clara dropped her gaze, unable to meet Naomi's eyes. Naomi sat back, her expression calm, not triumphant. She didn't need triumph. She had truth. "This room thought I was beneath it," she said softly. "But I was the foundation it stood on, and foundations don't ask permission to exist." The revelation was complete. The storm had broken, and for the first time, power belonged to the one who had never raised her voice. The silence in the boardroom fractured. No longer the smug quiet of arrogance, but the stunned hush of revelation. Every face around the table shifted, some paling, some flushing, all recalibrating. Richard Sloan, the once commanding voice of the room, slumped in his leather chair. His jaw hung loose, his breath uneven. For the first time in years, words failed him. His hand twitched toward his glass of water, but the tremor betrayed him. Clara Hensley gripped her pen so tightly her knuckles whitened. Moments ago, her voice dripped with superiority. Now, it cracked under the weight of consequence. She tried to speak, but only a whisper escaped. "CEO?" The pearl earrings she flaunted so confidently moments before now looked like cheap armor against a truth she couldn't fight. Mark Jennings leaned back, his earlier chuckle erased. Sweat beaded along his temple. He tugged at his tie as though it were choking him. The smirk he once wore replaced by the sick realization that his jokes were now evidence. At the far end, Ethan Cole sat straighter. His fingers, still resting on his tablet, hovered above the keyboard. He had recorded every insult, every dismissal, every command to escort her out. Now, for the first time, he allowed himself a thin smile. Vindication had a taste, and it was sharp. Dana adjusted her glasses with trembling hands. Her phone continued to record, the red light blinking steadily. She didn't bother to hide it anymore. Her eyes flicked to Naomi, and for the first time, they softened. Respect, real respect, had entered the room. The two security guards exchanged a glance. Mason, who had nearly laid a hand on Naomi, lowered his head. His partner stepped back fully, palms open at his sides, as though surrendering to a higher authority they hadn't recognized until now. Even the catering staffer in the hall, who lingered with a tray he no longer remembered holding, whispered under his breath, "She owns it." The receptionist outside, hearing the muffled revelation, froze mid-step, eyes widening. The ripple was spreading beyond the glass walls. Richard tried once more, voice shaking. This is a misunderstanding. Had I known..." Naomi cut him off, not with volume but with presence. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her gaze alone silenced him. Around the table, fear had replaced arrogance. Every smirk was gone, every chuckle erased. In their place, dread. The kind that comes when the roles flip and those who once mocked realize they are the spectacle now. From Ethan's side of the table came a sound no one expected. A soft clap. Just once, tentative. Then another joined. Dana, her phone still steady, brought her hands together slowly. Within seconds, the quiet applause grew not loud, not celebratory, but deliberate. A recognition, a reckoning. Naomi didn't smile. She didn't bask. She simply sat, composed, as the weight of the moment crushed those who had doubted her and lifted those who had witnessed her truth. The hierarchy had collapsed, and in its ruins, dignity stood tall. The applause faded into a charged stillness, every clap leaving behind a residue of unease. Naomi let the silence breathe. She didn't rush, Control wasn't about speed, it was about inevitability. She placed her hand lightly on the phone, still glowing before her. Carla's voice waited on the line, steady as a pulse. Naomi spoke, her tone measured. Final. Carla, record this directive. Effective immediately. Richard Sloan is removed from all negotiations related to this merger. His authority is rescinded. Access to corporate systems revoked. Legal to proceed with formal termination of his role. The words detonated like thunder, quiet but undeniable. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Mark's tie slackened further as his face drained of color. Richard shot up from his chair, his voice cracking. You can't do that. This is my company, my board. Naomi's eyes cut through him, steady as stone. Correction, this was your company. Until you forgot that respect is the cornerstone of leadership. Without it, titles crumble. Richard's fists slammed against the table. You can't walk in here and erase me. But Carla's voice arrived before Naomi even needed to respond. Directive confirmed. Sloan's access credentials are deactivated. Termination paperwork drafted. Board notification pending. The security guards shifted uncomfortably, their earlier confidence evaporating. Mason took a step back, as though instinctively distancing himself from a sinking ship. His partner whispered, "It's over." Richard spun toward the others at the table. "Say something. Don't just sit there." But no one moved. Clara avoided his eyes. Mark stared at his papers as if they could shield him. Ethan typed steadily, documenting the fall in real time. Dana kept recording, her lens steady, her expression cold. Naomi leaned forward, her presence quiet, yet commanding. "You spent this entire meeting mocking me, Richard. You told me I didn't belong. You called me staff. You laughed at my place in this room. And yet every contract, every share, every dollar tied to this deal flows through me. That's not arrogance, that's fact." She paused, letting the truth weigh heavier than any insult could. "You've mistaken cruelty for power, and today that mistake cost you everything." Richard's chest rose and fell in frantic rhythm. His hands trembled, his voice broke. This isn't how business is done." Naomi's gaze didn't soften. This is how justice is done." At that, she looked to Mason and his partner, her tone clipped. "Gentlemen, please escort Mr. Sloan out. He no longer has business here." The guards hesitated, then nodded. This time, they didn't reach for Naomi. They moved toward Richard, his face contorted in disbelief as they positioned themselves at his sides. "Don't touch me," he barked. But his protest was hollow, a shadow of the authority he thought he had. The room watched in silence as the man who once owned it was reduced to noise and anger. Naomi remained seated, calm, composed, unmoved. For once, justice didn't need to shout. It simply acted. The heavy doors shut with a final thud as Richard Sloan was led out, his protests dissolving into the hallway like smoke that no longer mattered. The boardroom exhaled, a collective release of tension that had been tightening since the moment Naomi entered. She remained seated, posture unbroken, eyes steady. The silence was hers now, not forced upon her, not weaponized against her, but owned. Carla's voice echoed once more from the phone. "Directive complete," Richard Sloan removed. "Legal and compliance have acknowledged." Naomi tapped the screen, ending the call. The glow faded, but the weight of what had just unfolded lingered like thunder after lightning. She looked around the table, one face at a time. No smirks remained. No laughter dared rise. Only the realization that power did not shout. It revealed itself. She spoke softly, but every syllable carried iron. "Respect is not optional. It's the price of admission. And when you fail to pay it, you forfeit your seat." Her words struck harder than Richard's shouting ever had. Clara lowered her gaze, pearl earrings trembling against her neck. Mark swallowed hard, pen forgotten. Dana nodded slowly, phone still recording, but now with a sense of purpose. Ethan typed the last line of his log, then set his tablet down, eyes filled with quiet pride. Naomi rose from her chair with deliberate calm. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. The simple act of standing was enough to shift the air. She gathered her notebook, slid her pen into its sleeve, and lifted her briefcase. At the doorway, she paused. Her eyes swept the room once more. "You mistook silence for submission. That was your last mistake." The words cut clean, final, a truth that would echo in every corridor of the firm long after she left. And then she walked out heels, steady against the floor, each step a reminder that dignity moves with its own gravity. Inside the boardroom, The witnesses sat in stunned quiet. Some would call their lawyers, some would reconsider their alliances. Some would replay the moment over and over, realizing they had seen not humiliation but history. For Naomi, it wasn't about vengeance, it wasn't about applause, it was about correction, a resetting of balance. She hadn't needed to shout, hadn't needed to plead. She simply revealed who she was. And that was enough. The skyline outside glittered against the glass, a city of deals and power plays. But in this room, in this moment, justice had been written without a single raised voice. Naomi stepped into the elevator, the doors sliding shut around her. Her reflection stared back, composed, unshaken, resolute. She whispered, almost to herself, but loud enough for the world if it had been listening. "I don't need to prove I belong. I built the table." The doors closed. The story ended. But the lesson remained.